were able to, I hope you're able to digest that information from session 1. That was pretty dense, but obviously we have the recordings on that if you want to revisit it. But I kind of feel that gives you a solid foundation and, really how those trees are growing, because now we're going to get into, picking that right tree for that right spot where you want to plant it. So that's what we're going to cover tonight. I'm going to turn my camera on so as not to distract, and then start the slideshow. Jenna, do I need to switch things?
Yes. Yep.
Okay, how's that?
Looks great.
Perfect. All right, here we go. Site assessment and tree selection. Okay. So this is the obviously the second session. Next Monday, we'll be talking about tree planting and tree care practices, and then developing plans on planting events and accessing resources. So that'll be a good one. And then there'll be a hands-on event at a point to be determined later. All right, so site assessment. So we do site assessments all the time in our reforestation projects. That's the first thing you're doing. You want to see where these trees are going, because trees, like any plant, they need 4 things in order to grow, whether it's a tomato plant or a grass on your lawn or a tree. Plants need moisture, they need water, soil moisture, they need nutrients, they need light, and then they need the air, like we talked about last time, from the soil. So they need those things. Your land, or the land that out there that we're planting in, provides all that for these plants. Access to light, depending what's on the surface. So we're going to kind of go into those things. But if you think about a garden, maybe you have a garden, it's a controlled environment. You can really grow any plant in the world in Delaware, as long as you're controlling those things. Delaware, I know, I've lived there, it's pretty flat. But if everything was the same, if all the soils were the same, if all the moisture was the same, all those pore spaces were the same across the board, you would have maybe 3 different trees growing in the state of Delaware. It'd be like tulip poplar, sweet gum, maybe, loblolly pine. So things that are going to grow really fast, take advantage of those really great soils. They'll outcompete everything. But our site conditions aren't the same. Even though Delaware is flat, there's things that are different. Now, I'll use this as an example. This, of course, is Iron Hill in Newark. No, I'm just kidding, but I know that is one of the higher points in Delaware, but I do use this because this is a mountain out in Western Maryland. But the site there is just a mountain. But if you think about the top of the mountain and the bottom of the mountain, the conditions for light are different. Okay, the top of the mountain's getting lots of light all day long. Bottom, depending where you are going to be shaded at some portion. If you're top of the mountain, the soils are going to be thinner. They're going to be more minerally. Okay, there's not a lot of organic material up there. As you go down, soils are thicker. It's a lot more moist, more organic material. Water, it's drier up top. Down in the valley, it's where the water goes. Water's moving. So the conditions that those plants need change depending where you are. Think of this side of the mountain compared to this side, the north side of the mountain compared to the south side. Different conditions of heat and how much sunlight it does get. So you're going to have different trees taking advantage of those things. It's providing that, because trees have adaptations and tolerances. Okay, they're adapted to grow best in certain conditions, but they have tolerances of other conditions that give them the advantage. Now, here are 3 trees that I pulled out that are, found in Delaware. Let's take this bald cypress on the left, and we have some nice bald cypress swamps. You'll often see bald cypress down in swamps in the muck, and they're beautiful. They grow really well down there. You see them down there, but that tree itself would prefer a loamy, well-drained, moist soil. That's how they would grow to be biologically the biggest that they can be. They grow faster on those soils. They go wider in those soils, but you don't see them in those soils because they're outcompeted by other trees. They tolerate those mucky conditions. They can outgrow any other tree in those conditions. That's why you find them down in the mucky swamps. Let's say on the right, they're the pitch pine. So pitch pine, you often find them in very shallow mineral type soils, dry soils. They can outcompete other trees and forests out that way. But if you put them on a well-drained, loamy, moist soil, they're going to grow to be the biggest that they can be. So they prefer those, but they can outcompete other trees on those dry mineral type soils. Beech is the same thing. A lot of times you see beech growing very, very slow in the understory. You know, they're very shade tolerant. They're growing slow, but if you were to move them and have them grow in the open light, as long as those soils were moist, well-drained, loamy soils, they would grow to be the biggest they can be. You know, they don't have problems growing in the open sunlight. It's all about that kind of moisture on that. So they have tolerances for that give them an edge. Okay. So I want you just to kind of take a look at this diagram. This is from a forestry textbook. So the bottom axis there is soil moisture. So that, remember that soil moisture is one thing that those plants need. The y-axis going up is volume of wood, essentially. The more, the higher you go, the more volume it puts on. So you look at 4 different tree species: Virginia pine, northern red oak, tulip poplar, and white ash. Now, the soils on the bottom, xeric means dry, mesic means moist, and hydric is wet. So you can see by volume, if you went into a nice mesic soil, that tulip poplar outgrows everything else. But if you notice those other species, the top of their arc is in that mesic soils. So they're going to put on the most wood, they're going to grow their biggest in those mesic soils. But they can't outcompete the tulip poplar in those conditions. But as you start to move to drier soils, well, tulip poplar can't make it. They have a short range. They do really well in those, but they kind of have that short range of tolerances for that. You know, you start to see where northern oak starts to dominate in there, where they can start to outcompete of those 4 trees. And really dry is Virginia pine. Not that they grow best there, but they can outcompete there. And you kind of look for the opposite too in the wet soils. You know, this is white ash right here is growing the best in the mesic soils, but they can't outcompete. They have to, you know, they outcompete in those hydric soils. So that's why when you're walking in the woods, depending where you are, you're going to start to see different types of species. It's where those trees can outcompete others. Now, there are a lot of human factors too, especially when we're planting trees. We're actually choosing areas that we want those trees to grow. So just coming back to this is in my neighborhood outside of Annapolis. There's that bald cypress right there. I mean, look how big those bald cypress trees are, but that's just someone's lawn. It just happens those soils are good for growing that tree. So what we're going to do now is kind of teach you how to do a site assessment. So you have an area where you want to plant trees. So what kind of information are you going to need to know in order to start planning for a project on that land? Okay, so we do this all the time. So in that Urban Watershed Forestry Manual, Part 3, there is a template for this. So that's why I love this guidebook. It's just, it'll take you through that. So the template's in there. You just kind of have to follow their template when collecting information. So it goes through a whole section, 1 through 7. I'll kind of get a little closer. Some general information, climate. You're going to look at topography, existing vegetation, soils, hydrology, and potential planting conflicts. So we're going to go through each one of those as if you were going to go do an assessment on a piece of land that you're going to plant, that you want to plant trees. So first one, just it's always important just to get general site information. You know, it could be an address, location of where it is, GPS coordinates, wherever you want. Just you got to know where it is and who owns the property. Is it an HOA? Are you working with, I don't know, a store or a business that owns a piece of property? Is it private property? Is it municipal property? And then what is the current land use there now? So, you know, you're taking this information away. You can always snap pictures and things, but it's good to list what that current land use is, because it'll help you with your planning on what you need to do to get a trees established. Like on the right, that's sort of an empty lot. So it's an empty lot. looks like there's grass there. You know, could be compacted. It could have been houses there at one time. On the left, it's a field, you know, kind of knows it's an ag field. So there's things to know about the ag fields. Second thing is climate. So plant hardiness zone, if you're a gardener, you kind of know what that is. It's just sort of the average number of days of the freezing cold days in the winter. So like I said, you can really grow, you know, any tree that you want, as long as you can bring them inside to you know, in a greenhouse to grow. But a lot of our trees, obviously our trees we're putting out there, they have to make it through the winter. So that's why you're not growing orange trees up here in Delaware. You know, it's too cold in the winter. It has too many consecutive days of cold. It would never last through a winter. The next thing is sunlight exposure. So this is the key one here. So because we're going to be able to select trees that tolerate various levels of sunlight, and that's the big one. So here in the East, trees are most competing for our light. So that's what they're going out for. So an area that has, you know, just evaluating area, and you can estimate how many hours of sunlight, direct sunlight, is getting per day. Something that's full sun, so a tree that needs full sun, like a tulip poplar, would need to have 6 or more hours of direct sunlight a day. Or let's say loblolly pine. Part sun or filtered light. So between really 3 and 6 hours of sun a day, you know, those are partially shade tolerant, or they need part sun. So that, you know, that would be like, you know, the maple, red maple, silver maple, something like that, can tolerate a little bit of shade. They only need those, you know, 3, 4, 5 hours of direct sunlight a day. And then there's areas where it's pretty shady. If it's getting less than 3 hours a day, those are shade tolerant trees that would be planting. Like, you know, sugar maple is a good example, or beech are great ones to have out there. Hemlock is another really shade tolerant one. So if it's a really shady area, you can get trees to go, but they need to tolerate that sun. They generally are slower growing trees. Microclimates, you're looking for, especially in a built environment, you know, areas with high wind exposure. It tends to dry out tissue, you know, on the trees, can blow things over, especially in a built-up area that reflected heat load. So think of a parking lot, a black parking lot. If you're planting near that, you know, it's in the midsummer, it's getting really hot, and it's reflecting that heat to adjacent trees. So, you know, here's an example of one of our reforestation projects, but really great soils. This was an old ag field, but our biggest concern, they were getting plenty of sunlight. So really a lot of trees that we had, we can put a huge variety of trees, but our big issue here was just the exposure of the trees to the wind. So it was vast areas, 25 acres, and it was, you know, high winds, very flat land down in St. Mary's County, Maryland. So this is that hardiness zone. There's not a great change between the areas. Most are the 7A, I guess, hardiness zones, a little bit in the 7B down in Sussex there. But why that's important and why that's changing, because, you know, our climate is changing. And our trees are adapting to, they're not adapting to it, but they're on the move from that. So I'm going to talk about 2 different species that you'll find in Delaware, which, you know, one's considered a northern tree and one's considered a southern tree. So you're going to have migrations of what kind of trees will tolerate. So our forest will actually naturally migrate in species composition. But like loblolly pine, very common tree. It's a southern pine. You might hear it called that. So that's its natural range here. But thinking in the future, because when we're planting trees, we're thinking about these trees 50 years from now, 100 years from now, that they could live that long. So we want something that's going to be adapted not only to the climate now, but to the climate into the future. So obviously trees like loblolly pine, who have a southern range, well, when it does get warmer around here, will migrate north. So you'll start to see more naturally populations of loblolly moving north, and you know, you can plant them. I mean, you can plant them in Pennsylvania now and we'll do fine, but that is only going to increase into the future. But things like sugar maple. Now, sugar maple is only native to the very top part of Newcastle County there. So as things get warmer, sugar maple are going to have a tough time surviving in these areas. Okay, so that gets you thinking about, well, maybe I'm not going to plant a sugar maple down in this area because it's never, in 20, 30 years, it just won't be able to survive. So thinking about that, of those tolerances. Topography, okay, making a quick note of, the slope. I know Delaware is flat, but there's areas where there are hills. So, knowing, are you planting at the bottom of the hill? Because those conditions are going to be different than what's at the top of the hill. And how you're going to plant is going to be slightly different. Just even little gradients of topography can have a difference. So this obviously is a built environment, kind of a homeowners association type thing here, the common land. Obviously making a note here, well, it's bottom of the hill, but it's probably gets so much water, it's just probably so compacted. But they have a drain right here. So obviously, there's some issues with that. So making a note of that in the site of assessment, that there might be drainage issues. Next thing is existing vegetation, is what's on the land that you're going to plant. So, a lot of times in areas, it might just be lawn that you're planting into. Well, just make a note of that. But, some areas there's going to be existing vegetation. Is this making a note what it is? Percent cover of it? Is it a shrub? Is it herbaceous? You may not even, trying to figure out what species it is great, because you have to figure out, is this something I need to deal with before I even put trees in the ground? That picture on the right, well, I admit that was one of our plantings. We didn't even notice it was in the seed bank, but that's the mile-minute vine. And, we planted in it, and they call it mile-minute for a reason, because it grows extremely fast. Within that first growing season, that area is just covered. It was covered. All our trees were covered. That was a major issue to that planting. So had we known, it might have been worth it for us to treat that area before even planting it, or maybe putting in, some sort of cover crop while we planted it. So kind of knowing that vegetation that's on your land, and maybe you want to deal with it first before planting trees. The next thing is your soils. And I'll kind of show you some tests that you could do on that. But remember last week, right, we talked about your soil being clay, loam, or sand. Okay, clay definitely has those small pores, if you remember, doesn't drain as well, but it can hold more nutrients than, let's say, sand, which drains really well, but doesn't hold as many nutrients. And remember, it's going to be a combination. You're not just going to have clay you're planting in, and you're not just going to be planting into sand, unless you're at the beach, I guess. It's going to be a mixture of that. So a type of loam, which tends to be a mixture. So knowing what kind of soil you have, I'll show you a quick test to determine that here in a second. Drainage, it's helpful if you go after a rainstorm to know what the drainage is, but I'll show you a test where you don't have to wait for a rainstorm to go see it, because if you see standing water, obviously drainage might be an issue in the place you're going to plant. Compaction, I'll show you a test of how to know if it's compacted or not. So compaction really deals, remember, with that pore space. If it's a compacted area, you're going to want to plant something there that can tolerate compacted soils. Like a pin oak is a great example, or willow oak that are used to be planted in compacted areas, like in urban areas, which tend to be compacted. pH, and then other things that you might be looking at, erosion, and I'll show you some pictures on that. Other types of construction that was in the area, debris, especially in urban areas, garbage, things like that. So for that soil texture, easy test is a very simple test. Just take a sample of the soil where you're going to want to plant, roll it into the ball, add some water, and this is the ribbon test. You can look it up online, but all you're going to do is kind of see what that texture is. If it's really sandy, you're going to feel that grit. But you roll it into the ball and you do what is called a ribbon test. You're just going to kind of squeeze it, and ribbon's going to form. And it's very easy. If that ribbon stays really long, well, that's clay. So clay has kind of that plastic feel, like you can mold it very easily. It's very sticky. That's a clay soil. But if it doesn't even roll into the ball well, that's a sandy soil. And so anywhere between, you can give a good estimate of what type of soils that you do have. And then you can find this online. It's very easy test. This has been around for forever to kind of know. Drainage. inexpensive way to test the drainage if you're not sure. Two methods right here. The method on the left is actually in that guidebook. The method on the right is just a PVC pipe, push it into the ground a few inches. You know, you want to dump some water into it, let it drain through. So, or do it a couple days after rain. You want to drain through, then pour it in again and you measure it. So you come back after an hour, and if it's only drained an inch of water is going on the ground, that's a poor drained soil. You know, anything from 2 inches up to 8 inches, you know, that's moderately pretty good drained soil. And if it's gone, you know, within an hour, then that's a pretty sandy soil. You can kind of do the same thing just by digging a hole. So you dig a hole, do the exact same thing. You're pouring water onto it, and you're just going to see how fast does it drain. I do like the method of digging a hole because you can often go a little bit deeper to get down into those lower levels. Remember where those roots are going to be in those top 3 feet of soil. So getting down, you can just dig up a hole 12 inches deep, kind of do the same thing. You're just measuring how quickly things are draining. This is tree planting is definitely not rocket science. And then compaction. So this is a big one. I mean, you can have compacted soils that are sandy soils. There's still compaction. And you can see here, there looks like, you know, cars drive on this area of this park. They probably do. Easy ways to test it, and this is out of the manual as well, is you don't want to do it on days like today where it hasn't rained forever. But a few days after it has rained in the spring, just take a screwdriver, push it in the ground. If it goes down real easy, it's not compacted. It's pretty good soil. So if it takes a little bit of force, you know, it's slightly compacted. If you really have to hit it hard, that's compacted soil. So you're going to have issues with that, but you want to match the tree that can tolerate the compaction. You know, if you want to go deeper into the soil, if you just had a piece of rebar, a sledgehammer, you can pound in, do the same thing. If you wanted to test, you know, like a screwdriver might be only 8 inches long. So if you wanted to go a little bit deeper and test down there, it's a good way to do it. This one just talks about the hydrology of the land. And that's, remember, just the upland versus riparian area. We plant different trees in the upland compared to the riparian area. So riparian area is just the land around a waterway. And it tends to be more moist. The soils tend to be better. It can often be flooded in certain times of year. So you would just match different trees than, you know, the upland. Where, let's say in the upland, if I wanted to pick oaks, you know, I might do a white oak on the upland because it's an upland tree species, but down in the riparian area, I might do a swamp white oak because they can tolerate the wetter conditions. So we'll show you how to select trees based on that here later in the presentation. Look for signs of erosion. You know, you may not be out there in the rain and see where the water goes, but the land does tell you where it does get wet and where things are eroding. Kind of mark that in the assessment. And then, you know, potential planting conflicts, especially in these built environments. You know, when we're planting in a farm field, we're not worried about that. So we don't have overhead wires and pavement and structures to deal with. But when you do plant in suburban, urban areas, you have to take that into consideration. Because you might be planting a smaller tree, but it's going to grow. So you'd rather not, after 10 years, realize you have to take that tree because it was planted a little too close to a sidewalk that's now heaving, or a structure, or it's hitting power lines. So kind of know where the wires are, the structures, pavement, lighting, anything like that. Kind of make notice of, like I said, any trash or dumping, any debris that you'd have to deal with, you know, piled concrete or broken concrete. Also, look for potential threats, like, you know, deer. Deer are probably the biggest threat to our trees or newly planted trees than really anything else. And another one is we sometimes encounter, especially planting near riparian areas or near lakes, or beavers. And they'll go after the trees that have been out there for a very long time. So it's kind of disheartening sometimes. I do like beavers, but sometimes they can really make quick work of the trees that you planted many years ago. Look for, you know, well, we'll get into site assessment with mowing. So here's what the deer are the big issues. These are on some of our sites. One is they love to eat the buds of the tree. And if you can remember me saying, that's where all that energy is. That's what's controlling the tree, is those end buds there. And that's what they love to eat. That's what high in nutrition for them, especially early in the, that late winter time before the buds break. They're just feasting on that stuff. And then, during the rut, in November, the males are, they're rubbing their velvet to get it off their antlers, but they're also marking, getting ready for the rut. So they can really damage the bark of some of our smaller trees. I wish they would just do it to large oaks who can tolerate that stuff, but they tend not to do that. So they can be damaged. This is the tree I planted, and I did have some damage. You got to also watch out for dogs. So it was my dog just, for some reason, loves to be like a deer, I guess. And then if you can think about the history, so what was on the site that you're going to plant previously? What was there, a couple of years ago? So here's a site. This is a perfect example. I mean, this looks like it'd be a great place to put, a tree on the house. There's existing vegetation there, but 6 months ago, that's what that place looked like. So it was a house under construction, a new house, but look at the soil. It's highly compacted soil. The lawn was obviously rolled on, but that's something you just won't encounter just by looking at it. You kind of get there and feel around, figure out what was there previously, look for compaction, drainage issues. And then the last thing, obviously, it is required, but call me utility to find out those underground lines. You need to do that by law, so it's free. You just gotta, before a planting event, you just have to have the lines marked so you're not in conflict with them. And then planting maintenance and logistics. Now, this is something when we get into the planting plans, we'll kind of go over, but it's something while you're there, you should be thinking about. If you're looking at an area to plant trees, think about when you finally do plant those trees there. Is there areas where you can set materials? Because we'll talk about them, mulching, shovels, trucks. You might have a pickup truck to bring stuff in. Do you have access to the site? How are you going to do that? So making kind of a notice of that in your site assessment would just save you headaches later. Think about how those trees are going to be watered. And we'll talk about that, watering trees, when we talk about planting next week. But is there a water source nearby? Is there a spigot nearby? You're going to rely just on rain. Is there a stream nearby where you can pull buckets of water out from that? And we've done that on several sites. Think about where that water's going to come from and how you're going to get that watering in through the growing season. This is always helpful for us. You can just hand draw this, but having a map of the area that you're going to plant. Because there you can write in where those drainage issues are, where your structures are, where sidewalks are, where you're seeing deer damage. You can write that down, but having a good site map or a sketch, just sketching it out, will be it'll be very handy when you're going to go plan what kind of trees you're going to plant there, because you kind of lay it out from that map that you just took. So this could be hand drawn. We just use, Google Maps a lot. This was a very simple one we did at a school up in Cecil County, Maryland, where it was, they made it for us. It was like green areas is where we want trees, red areas we don't. Very simple to follow, but we know from that is how can we start planning now when we know exactly where they want the trees. Okay. And there's so many ways to make a map right now. Google Earth, just Google Maps, Web Soil Survey, First Map. I went on there today to take a look. That's through Delaware, free program. So even counties, Sussex County has its own mapping program. So you can kind of draw maps from there. It allows you to do that. They're pretty easy to use as well, but have a good map. All right, so what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to look through various sites. I took some pictures of various sites, and we'll kind of talk about what I would do when I approach a site. I'm arriving now. I want to plant trees. What's the site look like? So what I'm going to notice though is when I first come here, obviously, it's part of a park. It's common ground. this is an entrance, so you can be assured this is there for cars to be driving on. So obviously you don't plant there, but this is also going to be very compacted area. Next things I would think about are these overhead lines right up here. Not getting too close to that. And then I'm thinking about maintenance, okay? Because obviously this is mowed right now. You're going to plant a tree, but you have a fence right here. So obviously the fence not moving anywhere. You just want to make sure you're making notice that you want to plant these trees away from the fence. So if a mower needs to get behind it, it can do that easily. If you plant too close to the fence, then it's an issue when people are trying to mow and things like that. And often they get too close and hit the tree, that kind of thing. So that's one thing on that. All right, here's a community clubhouse down here. So it's common ground here. Very skinny lot, just a lot of lawn. You have both sides here. Major thing to think about here is, since it is a skinny lot, is where is the sun coming from? Where are the cardinal directions here? Because you want to see, if you plant a tree here, how much light is it going to get in the day? Is the sun coming from that house straight at you as you're looking at this, or is it going across where those trees are? So you need to think about where the sun's going and how much light is getting into that site right there. Okay, on this one, this just happens to be a house nearby, but it had some interesting things that I wanted to point out. So obviously the main thing is that huge hill. It's very, very steep hill. I make notice of, the hill, especially if you have volunteers, you want to come out and help plant. Something to think about, steep hills, but also those conditions at the top of the hill are going to be different than what's at the bottom of the hill. If that area is even compacted, you can almost see, because of the topography of the hill, where the water is going to start to run, any of the surface stuff that's going to run. Kind of runs into that vegetation. There's a sewer line right there you see at the bottom of that picture. So staying away from that. And then obviously the driveway there is staying far enough off the driveway, wherever you're going to plant your tree. So wherever in that property you're going to put your tree or trees. This one's a little pocket park, common ground, open in the area. It has a view over some water, but a couple things I'd think about there that are different. The sign, road sign. So even though you might be planting something small or even a shrub, is thinking about that plant in 20 years or whatever. Is it going to be an issue for the visibility of that sign? Or is the county, I think it's the county road, going to make you trim it, or are they going to do it for you? Next thing I would think about is the overhead lines. Again, existing road. You'll see that red cedar there. That's the one tree right there. It's seeing where the sun goes, but staying far enough off that so your trees are getting enough light. And then kind of the last thing I'm thinking here is that vegetation right there in the center. So that actually goes down over a hill. I can see there's some vines growing in it. That could be an issue for your trees after planting. So is there a plan to make sure those vines from that hillside don't come into the planting area? Will that area be continuously mowed or not? So that'd be an issue I'd think about on that. This is another one, park. Here's a parking lot. Here, kind of common ground. Main thing is obviously this high grass area would need to be mowed before you planted anything. That's existing vegetation, but I'd kind of want to know why that grass was so tall in there. It's maybe they just didn't want to mow. Maybe it's some sort of grass meadow or something, or maybe it's just so wet in there that they just don't mow it because it stays wet. But that's important things to kind of be aware of and notice. So there is something in those guidebooks that, it picks areas that you could potentially be planting in. And it gives you on this graph or this table, things to think about. With the half moon being, maybe a consideration, with the full moon there being definitely it's a consideration. So it's a good little handy tool to look at depending where you're planting. All right, so does anyone have any questions on that, on site assessment? All right, we're going to go into tree selection. So you often hear this when planting a tree, it's the right tree for the right spot. Okay, so that's, what's on your land. you want to match it from the land conditions to the tree that's going to do well in those conditions. So I'm going to take you on a little journey first here. This is around my community, which they did some tree planting, and I'm not even sure what they were thinking on it. So here's a tree that was planted. Something they didn't consider was that white mulberry tree that's already occupying that space, or at least the branches are. Now, white mulberry, they grow very aggressive. They're a non-native invasive tree, but that tree was kind of planted right in an existing vegetation area. So it's already under competition right there. So I would have either dealt with the white mulberry or moved that tree off about 10 feet or so. This was, I'm sure, planted years ago. This is a red cedar. Red cedar grow very, very, very fast. Actually, you can see several red cedars in there, but they do get overtopped quickly. So, I mean, this tree may only be 20 years old, but they do not tolerate shade at all. So as soon as hardwoods overtake them and block out the sun or limit their sun, they die. So they die very easily. That's normally what happens in a field anyways. But if you wanted to keep that red cedar going, it would have to have sunlight. Here's another one in my neighborhood. This is a sycamore. This is probably a $200 tree. So it's ball burlap tree.
Locally adapted trees are more likely to survive and thrive when grown in.
That sounds doing some extra research. I like it. So this is a sycamore. So it's a ball and burlap tree. We'll talk about that next week, what that means. All that means it's a big tree. It's a nice tree. It's an expensive tree. So sometimes people plant that, you kind of get that instant gratification of a tree already being there. It would do well. Sycamores do really well in urban areas. They can do very well in urban areas and cultivars of them, like London plane tree. But, this looks like it could be a good place. But I walked up to that tree and took a look up. So you can see what the issue is of putting that tree in there is. It started out to be a good area, but they grow very fast, but it's going to be growing right into that black locust. So the black locust is already over top of it. So that really was, probably a $400 investment, from the tree and planting it and caring that, well, it's going to be shaded out. So it's just not going to do well. There's a conflict already where maybe they should have just moved it to a different area to put that tree. So what I'm going to do now is we're going to look at some of these trees and really how they can be different, which is kind of cool. So this just happened to be, this was our first Tree Stewards group in Anne Arundel County in Maryland. We were working with the county on this, and they actually have trees to provide to the Tree Stewards so they can use to plant within their own community. But they have a set list of trees that they have access to and they want planted. So I took their list early, and I just kind of want to show you, if you're given a list or you're at the nursery or whatever, and you have an options for a list, there's a lot of great trees, but you kind of want to match that tree to the site. But let me show you how different some of these trees are. So I picked two of the small understory trees. So this was the serviceberry and the sumac. So those are two understory trees. They do very well. They're both native, both very important wildlife understory trees. But they can be drastically different. So I'm going to show you this website later, but if you look at kind of the tolerances for these trees. So here is the sumac. First of all, can grow really anywhere in the Chesapeake area, coastal plain all the way up to the mountains. So it has a wide geography. You can check out how big it gets. That's important to know. So the height gets 50 feet, the spread 50 feet. But take a look down at sun exposure. So knowing its tolerances, it needs full sunlight. Like that red cedar, as soon as you get shade over it, it's done. So this usually is that pioneer species. So anything that needs full sun and grows fast, they're the ones that usually come out first, occupy the sites first. Look how it does that. I mean, look at the soil texture. It can grow in clay, loamy, or sandy soils. Moisture, though, dry or moist. So it can't be wet. So you won't find these growing down in riparian areas. They need dry soil or moist. They cannot tolerate kind of the wet soils. Important to note If you look at their habitat, dry or moist, the poor fertile soils, old roadsides. So they kind of need that area where there's open sunlight. They occupy it. But a good note on that one, it spreads lateral roots to form colonies. So that's important to know about the trees that you're going to plant, is how they're going to behave. So this one is great, but they'll form colonies. They put out rhizomes or roots, and they'll put up a new individual, a new specimen of themselves from that root. So they can spread that way, kind of like bamboo in a way, not as aggressively as bamboo. So now let's look at the serviceberry and how it differs. Okay, it kind of grows in that same area, same size actually. So those are two kind of equal right now. They grow anywhere and the size is there. But look at the sun exposure. They do really well in partial sun and shade. So they're opposites when they do it that way. Soil texture, same thing, clay, loamy, and sandy. That's probably why they're on the resilient list. They can tolerate a lot of things. But look at the soil moisture. So this and the sumac both had moist, but this can tolerate wet soils. Okay, so you probably wouldn't plant it in the uplands, in those dry soils. So they're opposite where they're going to be found that way. So those are just two drastically different. I'm going to skip that for a second. And now let's look at two trees. I picked two really similar ones off that list. Sugar maple, their Latin name is even ridiculously close. Sugar maple and silver maple. So if that's on your list and you're deciding which one to plant, okay, same thing. Looking at the sugar maple, Mountain Piedmont area, which makes sense for that northern part of Delaware. Everything else is the coast plain, but sun exposure, full sun, partial sun, shade. So they do really well wherever they're going to do it, different loamy or sandy soils, but look at the moisture. They're only doing well in that mesic soil, that moist soil. So you're not going to find them up on the top of the hill, and you're not going to find them down the riparian area. They can grow there, but they don't grow extremely well there. They prefer they're very site sensitive. So let's compare that to the silver maple. So the silver maple, kind of the same geography, same everything, full sun or partial sun. So they don't do well in the shade at all, but they can do extremely well in the full sun. Texture, all three soils, but look at their moisture, moist and wet. So you'll find them along our waterways, but you're not going to find them on the kind of the top of the mountain. So they're slightly wider than that. So when you're selecting, you have your site conditions. When you're selecting the tree from that, you're going to pay attention to where these trees will do the best to help you kind of pick what you want. And that information actually came from nativeplantcenter.net. And this is a website I highly, highly recommend that you check out. So this is a site that we put together with U.S. Fish and Wildlife. It was actually a U.S. Fish and Wildlife kind of publication. So it's kind of like a big thick magazine that they had for years. And it had kind of every native plant in the mid-Atlantic, from grasses all the way up to canopy trees, and kind of all their conditions they need to grow, all the attributes that they have. So this is kind of a wonderful website. You actually can, and maybe I'll show you at the end, but you can go in there and say, I want a canopy tree, like I did to find those. I want a canopy tree that does well in partial sunlight to shade and loamy soils in this region. And it'll spit out a list of all the trees that match those attributes. It's a really, really cool website. But also in that guidebook that we had, the Watershed Manual, Forestry Watershed Manual, it has it in the index as well. So this we kind of talked about, I told you about that last week, that it was located in that book. But it's going to go through some very common urban trees that are planted, and it's going to give you their tolerances, those conditions that they can tolerate. So let's take a look. I don't know. Let's look at basswood, which I like a lot. So it's going to go through and give you, saturated or wet soils. Can it tolerate? Yeah, moderately. So M is moderately, I is intolerant, and T is tolerates. So moderately tolerates that. Moist, well drained. Yes, it prefers that. Tolerates periods of dry. So they can take those kind of droughty conditions a little bit. prolonged drought like we're having now, it's not great for them. So they can be intolerant of that. Sun exposure, they prefer that full sun, but can tolerate a little bit of shade. Intolerant of full shade. They tolerate all soil conditions. And you can see all the kind of the other stuff here. This is more, a lot of times, the urban conditions, the salt tolerances, being next to salted roads, soil compaction, that's a big one for those urban areas. Pest, disease tolerances, and this is just in general, flood and things like that. But you can take a look through here in that guidebook. The great thing about that publication has great indexes. So a lot of great information in there. And you can actually even see, looking through this list, it is going to list a lot of native trees like hornbeam, hot hornbeam, holly, but it's also going to have hybrids. So things like American elm hybrid, because of Dutch elm disease wiping out the American elm, but there's a lot of hybrid elms that are tolerant to that disease that you can plant, and they have the same attributes as the American, but they're hybrids. So they're variations of the original. So they're not kind of purely native, but they also have, trees that aren't native at all. Like the more macchia, I don't even know what that tree is, to be honest. But it's in there, kind of gives you those tolerances. But there's various other ones out there that'll do well in those urban environments. They may not be native, but they'll do well. So that's really up to you, kind of what you want to plant. We tend to try to plant natives, like I said, but sometimes when you get a variety on a tree, a hybrid, that'll do well. It'll give you the same kind of attributes that you want in that suburban or urban area. Let's plant it. Let's just get trees there. As long as they're not invasive, they'll escape somewhere, like mimosa tree or something. All right, we're coming to the end of this session, but I'd be remiss if I didn't tell you my favorite trees to plant in those kind of urban settings. They're Craig's Magnificent Seven. This is the ones that I like a lot. They've done really well for us, both in rural reforestation and more suburban urban plantings. But this is probably one of my favorite trees, the hackberry. So it's common hackberry, Celtis occidentalis. And the reason, you can see, first of all, it's related to the elm. It's in the same family as the elm. You can grow it anywhere. This is such a hardy tree. It takes a licking. Look at the sun exposure. Anything you throw at it, it does well. Clay, loam, sandy, dry, flooded, mat, anywhere you want it. So it's a good tree. It's a good wildlife tree. Produces those berries in the fall. Has that corky bark. It's just a really oddball, cool looking tree. So that's one of my favorites. Black gum, also for the kind of the similar reason. They do really well on different soil moisture regimes, upland. Riparian, they grow anywhere. They can tolerate, partial sun, full sun. They're not a shade tolerant ones, but they're also good ones. Another good wildlife tree. And the reason I like this too is the leaves they just get this really red purple in the autumn. They're a very beautiful tree. So we end up using a lot because it does really well for us. As far as canopy, I do love oaks. We do try to get a lot of oaks in. This is a good one that you do see in urban environments. It's not the best one, that it doesn't take the biggest licking out there, but it does really well. It grows for us, and that's the northern red oak. Southern red oak's a good one as well if you're in Delaware, but because it grows well for an oak. Oak tend to grow very slow. This one does really well and can tolerate some of those urban conditions, but nothing like that. The willow oak. Willow oaks are great. So they're used to growing along waterways, so they've always tolerated kind of the flooded areas. So they do well in kind of compacted soils, and there's clay and poorly drained soils. So it's another really great one. It's in the red oak group as well. It does well. Pin oak's another one I like that does well in those conditions. Red maple, it's the one I almost love to hate, because some days I love it, some days I hate it. It's out there everywhere, but it grows so well. It grows fast. There's variety. Sometimes it's overplanted, but there is something about that tree. It's an early pollinator, so it'll put out its flowers in February if it can. So, which is good for, it's wind pollinated, but insects can use it kind of as an early source of nectar when they're first emerging. So it's a good tree. American sycamore, it's just a pretty tree, grows really well, grows very fast. Their cultivars, London plane tree is ones that you see planted in urban areas all the time. They do really well. They have a tendency to lift sidewalks. They get a real big root mass down at the bottom, but they do tolerate urban conditions very well. And the last one's persimmon. Persimmon is just a great tree. It's a native fruit that it can produce, but they do tolerate kind of those, mucky areas, not mucky areas, but they can tolerate, first of all, some shade, but, just compacted, sort of poorly drained soils as well. So they do really well. They're not like bald cypress and grow out of muck, but they do fairly well. And then that's all I had for today. So now it's time for any questions that we might have. I don't know if Jenna, if you
Yeah, we had one come into the chat a little bit ago. So if anyone has additional questions, feel free to add them to the chat. But this one that we have is asking if trees grown from local seeds are better.
Yes, well, it depends. So anything grown, especially from seed that are local, is better than something that's far away, for sure. And it's just because the genotype of that tree have adapted, for centuries to these conditions that they're grown in. Like a white oak grown, down in Arkansas might grow differently than, the white oaks that are growing in Delaware. It may not be something you notice right away, but yeah, so that local seed has that local genotype as well. So, locally sourced seeds, I think, are the best to try to grow in our area. That said, seeds, it's hard to find seed, believe it or not, or hard to find people willing to go out and collect seed. And a lot of the nurseries, the native plant nurseries, and these are like the state nurseries that are growing the seed. I mean, they're taking the seed and growing the plants and giving the trees right out. That's where we get our trees. They're having tough time finding the seed source. So I prefer it, yeah, but sometimes we have to go out. But you're right, local is, I think, better.
Another question is, are there any native trees that are good for urban areas?
Oh yeah. Some of the stuff that I was saying, those on the magnificent ones, yeah, any of those on that list were good. Those were all native trees, all good for urban environments. Anything on that list in the urban forestry watershed manual tend to be trees that are selected for urban areas. And most of them are native. And I don't know, Keisha or Taryn, if you guys had a specific list of trees that you guys like to use in your urban plantings.
We just kind of, do as you just instructed this evening, which is, depending on the site, that's how we kind of determine. We do have a list on our website that folks probably have seen, and I wouldn't necessarily say that it focuses on urban areas per se, but it's just a kind of like an example of some of the trees that could be planted in Delaware based on size, height, at maturity. So we just have it as a reference, and we usually encourage people to, have us out and take a look so that we can kind of tailor it to their site.
Good.
Yeah, so another question related to tree ID. So which characteristics of a tree do you use most to identify a tree, or do you use an app?
Yes, I don't use an app because I can't use them very well, but that's a really good question. We do teach tree ID a lot. Leaves are I think the easiest to start out with. Most of the guidebooks, start you with leaves. I think the easiest is when you start to get to know them is by bark, just because bark doesn't really change that much, and they can tell you a lot, but I use everything. So, you know, sometimes I'll have a leaf and then it looks similar to something else. I'll check out the bark when comparing the two, or you know, look for fruits, you know, that type of thing. So there's a lot of different things you can use. I would say leaves are always the good first start one, but you know, in wintertime, that's tough to do. So you can start to learn bark. That's a good one too. But those apps are good. I've seen people use them. I'm just old school. I still use a book. I still use a dichotomous key though on some.
That was our last question, unless anyone else has more.
Excellent. Well, good. Well, so next week we are going to talk about the proper way to plant and care for trees. So this is a crucial one that we have. If you can't make it to that one, that's perfectly fine. We do record all of these. We'll send it out to the registration list when they're ready to go. So we don't expect you that you can always make to every single one. But you can always catch up with them on the recordings as well. So.
Oh, we had a couple of questions come in as you were wrapping up, Craig. Someone's asking if you recommend red buds.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Redbud's a great tree. I have one in the front of my house too. They do well. Yeah, I think they do really well. They can do well in urban conditions. They fix nitrogen. They're a great tree.
Awesome. I have one in front of my house too. Last question is just asking if the group could get a certificate of participation by the end of the 4 training days.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I'll defer to Delaware Forest Service on that one. This is their training.
Yeah, so our goal was to have folks participate in these 4 trainings, and then we wanted to encourage folks to come to an in-person maintenance day on the 25th. I think Taryn can clarify. It's going to be at Seaford, and we wanted to take that opportunity to talk some more about some of the things that we've learned in these 4 sessions, as well as mulch and water some of the trees there in Seaford. And then, and then at the end, folks would certainly be certified.
Yes, Keisha, that training will be on the 25th of June.
Oh, and I saw the question, the native tree site. It's called nativeplantcenter.net. And I can send that out. We can send that out when that recording is sent out as well. nativeplantcenter.net. You'll see the Alliance. I think you get to it from the Alliance for the Chesapeake's website as well.
A couple
Oh,
other
Keisha,
questions for Taryn and Keisha regarding the 25th maintenance day.
Yeah, we can put together, we can make sure that at the next section, we have a slide for Craig to share with the details. We're still working out the logistics with Parks and Rec down in Seaford, but we'll definitely have that by next session.
Well, good. Okay, everyone. Well, we'll see you then on Monday, if possible. Same kind of bat time, same bat station. Enjoy your weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you, Craig.
Thank you, Craig.
Thanks, Jenna.